The hum of the servers was a lullaby to me, a constant, gentle reminder of the digital heart of the company I'd helped build. 16 years. 16 years, and every single one of them had been poured into this place, into crafting the very core of its operations. My name is Helen, and for a decade and a half, I was the quiet architect behind the company's most vital asset, its licensing engine. It wasn't glamorous work, not like the flashy marketing campaigns or the sleek product launches, but it was fundamental. Without my engine, the entire intricate machinery of our business would grind to a halt. It was the unsung hero, and I, its dedicated guardian. I joined when the company was little more than a dream and a garage. Mr. Henderson, the founder, was a visionary, a man who saw potential where others saw only risk. He believed in me, in my meticulous attention to detail, my ability to untangle complex systems and build robust solutions from the ground up. We grew together, the company and I. I started as a junior developer, then moved into systems architecture, eventually becoming the principal engineer for our intellectual property and licensing division. The licensing engine wasn't just code, it was a fortress, protecting our patents, managing our client agreements, ensuring every piece of our proprietary software was legally sound and accounted for. It was my magnum opus, a digital tapestry woven with countless hours of logic, foresight, and a deep understanding of both technology and corporate law. My office wasn't fancy. It was a comfortable corner filled with stacks of legal documents, technical manuals, and a perpetually brewing pot of tea. The walls were adorned with old flowcharts, diagrams tracing the evolution of the engine, a visual history of my life's work. Colleagues would often joke that I knew the licensing engine better than I knew my own reflection, and they weren't wrong. I could troubleshoot a problem in my sleep, anticipate potential issues before they arose, and explain the most convoluted legal clause with simple clarity. I was respected, valued, and, I thought, indispensable. Then Mr. Henderson retired. It wasn't a sudden departure. His health had been declining for a few years. He passed the torch to his son, Julian. Julian Henderson. Even now, the name leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Julian was everything his father wasn't: entitled, arrogant, and utterly devoid of the quiet wisdom that had made his father a true leader. He'd breezed through an Ivy League MBA program, armed with buzzwords and a disdain for anything that smacked of old guard. He walked into the company like a bull in a china shop, convinced that his youth and a glossy degree instantly made him superior to anyone who'd actually built the foundations he now stood upon. The changes started subtly. New, flashy furniture appeared in the lobby, replacing the comfortable, worn pieces that had seen countless clients come and go. The coffee in the break room went from decent to undrinkable. Then came the efficiency audits, a euphemism for Julian's thinly veiled attempts to cut costs by slashing salaries and benefits. He brought in a cadre of young, inexperienced consultants, fresh out of business school, who spoke in jargon and seemed to believe that real-world experience was a weakness, not a strength. They'd wander through the offices, clipboards in hand, looking at people like me with a mixture of curiosity and thinly disguised contempt. I tried to adapt. I really did. I attended the mandatory innovation workshops, where we were told to think outside the box by people who'd never actually built a box in their lives. I listened to Julian's rambling speeches about synergy and disruption, biting my tongue when I wanted to point out that true disruption often came from understanding the existing system, not simply dismantling it. I even offered to mentor some of the newer, younger employees, hoping to pass on some of the institutional knowledge that Julian seemed so eager to discard. But Julian saw me differently. He saw my experience as a burden, my tenure as a liability. To him, I wasn't an asset. I was legacy, a relic. He wanted to streamline, to modernize, to prune what he considered the deadwood from the company tree. And I, with my 16 years of dedicated service, my deep-rooted understanding of the very engine that powered his empire, was at the top of his chopping block. I could feel his eyes on me during meetings, a cold, calculating gaze that made my skin crawl. He'd interrupt me, dismiss my suggestions, and often he'd just look away when I was speaking, as if my words were an inconvenience. The atmosphere in the office grew toxic. The camaraderie that had once defined our workplace evaporated, replaced by an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. People started whispering about who would be next, about the arbitrary firings that seemed to have no basis in performance. Morale plummeted, and the quality of work began to suffer, though Julian seemed oblivious, too wrapped up in his own self-importance to notice the cracks forming in the foundation. The day it happened is etched into my memory with the clarity of a freshly cut diamond. It was a Tuesday, a crisp autumn morning. I was in my office, debugging a minor issue with a new client's licensing agreement, when Julian's assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah, poked her head in. "Helen, Mr. Henderson would like to see you in his office." Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with a pity I instantly recognized. I knew. My stomach dropped, a cold knot forming deep within me. I walked down the long corridor, the familiar sounds of keyboards clicking and phones ringing suddenly distant, muffled. Each step felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. Julian's office was at the end, a glass-fronted monolith that screamed new money. He was sitting behind a massive, polished desk, framed by a panoramic view of the city skyline. He didn't look up as I entered, instead fiddling with a designer pen. Across from him sat a woman I didn't recognize, impeccably dressed with a severe bun and an unreadable expression. A lawyer, I thought, with a chilling certainty. "Helen," Julian said, finally looking up, his tone flat, devoid of any warmth. He didn't offer me a seat. "Thank you for coming. We're making some structural adjustments." He paused, as if expecting me to applaud. "As part of these necessary changes, your position is being eliminated." My breath caught in my throat. Eliminated. Not "you're fired," but "your position is eliminated," as if I were a piece of furniture, easily discarded. The words hung in the air, heavy and blunt. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a scene unfold on a screen. "Eliminated?" I managed, my voice a thin reed. "Yes." He leaned back, a smug expression on his face. "We're moving in a new direction, a more agile, forward-thinking approach. We need fresh talent, people who are aligned with our modern vision. Frankly, Helen, your approach is outdated. You're dead weight." Dead weight. 16 years of my life, 16 years of building, innovating, safeguarding, reduced to 2 contemptuous words. The detachment shattered, replaced by a searing bolt of anger, quickly followed by a wave of humiliation so profound it made my ears ring. I looked at the lawyer, who remained impassive. I looked back at Julian, his eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction. "I understand this is difficult," he continued, his voice dripping with false empathy, "but it's for the best. We'll be offering you a standard severance package, of course. Sarah will walk you through the paperwork." He gestured vaguely towards the door. "We'll need you to clear out your office by the end of the day. Your access will be revoked tonight." End of the day. Tonight. No notice, no respect. Just a cold, calculated dismissal after dedicating nearly 2 decades to his father's company. My mind raced, a jumble of accusations and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to point out every single contribution, every late night, every crisis averted because of my work. But something held me back. A quiet dignity, perhaps, or a nascent spark of something colder, something more dangerous. I simply nodded, my jaw tight. Understood. I turned and walked out, my back ramrod straight, ignoring the pity in Sarah's eyes as I passed her desk. I didn't look back. The walk to my office felt even longer than the walk to Julian's. When I reached my door, I closed it gently, then leaned against it, the metallic taste of betrayal filling my mouth. I sat at my desk, the hum of the servers no longer a lullaby, but a mocking drone. My office, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. I stared at the old flowcharts on the wall, the diagrams of my life's work, and a cold fury began to simmer beneath my shock. Dead weight. He truly believed that. He believed he could simply discard me and the years of irreplaceable knowledge I possessed. But as I looked at my desk, at the stacks of documents, a different thought began to form. My contract. My original employment contract, and every amendment, every policy update, every internal memo I'd ever received. I was meticulous. I kept everything. And in that moment, a flicker of defiance ignited within me. Julian might see me as deadweight, but I saw something else entirely. A contract. A long and detailed contract, potentially riddled with his oversights. I spent the next few hours in a blur, clearing my office as instructed. Each item I packed felt like a piece of my identity being stripped away. The framed photo of Mr. Henderson and me at the company's 10-year anniversary party. The ergonomic keyboard I'd customized. My favorite tea mug. As I carefully placed my personal effects into a cardboard box, my mind was already racing, not with sadness, but with a growing, steely resolve. I would not go quietly into the night. I took the severance package Sarah handed me, a thick envelope filled with legal speak. I signed nothing. I simply took it. As I walked out of the building for the last time, the autumn sun seemed to mock me with its brightness. The air felt colder, sharper, but so did I. I wasn't just a woman who had lost her job. I was a woman who had been betrayed, and betrayal demanded a response. The first few days were a blur of anger, grief, and a profound sense of disorientation. My routine, which had been the anchor of my life for so long, was gone. I found myself staring at the walls, aimless, lost. But the anger, the quiet, burning anger, refused to subside. It fueled me. It reminded me that I wasn't just a victim, I was a fighter. I pulled out my copies of every employment document I possessed. My original contract from 16 years ago, thick with clauses and addendums. Performance reviews, all stellar. Company policy handbooks from various years. Emails from HR. My intellectual property agreements. I spread them across my dining room table, a vast paper landscape of my professional life. I made myself a strong cup of tea, put on my reading glasses, and began to read. Every word, every clause, every footnote. It was tedious, painstaking work. Legal jargon is designed to be dense, opaque to the uninitiated, but I was initiated. My work on the licensing engine had required a deep dive into intellectual property law, contract law, and compliance. I understood the nuances, the subtle traps, the precise language that could make or break an agreement. I started highlighting, making notes, cross-referencing. My analytical mind, honed by years of complex system design, was now laser-focused on a single, vital task: finding Julian's mistakes. It started with small things. The severance package they offered was less than what was stipulated in my original contract, which had a clause for long-term employees with my tenure. Then there was the notice period. My contract clearly stated a 6-month notice for senior-level employees, or payment in lieu thereof. Julian had given me a few hours. That was a significant violation. My benefits, too, were cut off immediately, despite a clause that guaranteed continuation for a specific period after termination without cause. But the real goldmine, the true heart of my revenge, lay within the intellectual property clauses related to the licensing engine. When I had designed and built the engine, Mr. Henderson, with his foresight, had included a unique clause in my contract. It stipulated that while the company owned the IP, I, as the principal architect, retained certain consulting rights and responsibilities for its ongoing maintenance and critical updates. More importantly, it included a provision for a substantial, recurring royalty payment tied to the engine's continued use and profitability. a payment that Julian had clearly overlooked or deliberately ignored in his haste to label me dead weight. This wasn't just about my salary or severance. This was about the very lifeblood of the company and my undeniable, legally binding connection to it. My contract stated that any significant changes to the engine's core architecture or the development of a replacement would require my consultation or a substantial buyout of my rights. Julian had simply tried to cut me off, assuming I would just disappear. The deeper I delved, the more infuriated I became. It wasn't just arrogance, it was gross negligence. Julian, in his eagerness to assert his authority and rid himself of the old guard, had completely disregarded established legal agreements. He had, in essence, driven a bulldozer through the legal framework of his own company, and I had the blueprints to prove it. My next step was clear. I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in corporate employment law and intellectual property. I asked around, discreetly at first, then more openly. I found Sarah Chen, a formidable attorney known for her sharp intellect and tenacious approach. Her office was modern, minimalistic, a stark contrast to my cluttered home. She listened patiently as I laid out my case, a thick binder of highlighted documents and meticulous notes spread before her. She picked up my original contract, her eyes scanning the fine print. Her expression, initially guarded, slowly shifted to one of growing interest, then a faint smile. "Helen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is quite the oversight on their part, especially this clause regarding the licensing engine. This isn't just about wrongful termination. This is about potential intellectual property infringement and breach of contract on a significant scale." The validation was intoxicating. It wasn't just my anger speaking, it was the law. I wasn't crazy. Julian was wrong, and he was about to pay a very heavy price. Sarah explained the strategy. First, a strongly worded letter to the company's legal department, detailing all the violations. This would be a soft opening, a chance for them to rectify the situation without public spectacle. But I knew Julian. He wouldn't back down easily. He would see it as a challenge, an old woman trying to cling to the past. And I was right. The company's initial response was dismissive. A junior lawyer, clearly acting on Julian's instructions, sent a boilerplate reply, offering a slightly increased severance but denying any wrongdoing regarding IP or the notice period. They tried to paint me as a disgruntled former employee, trying to extort money. They underestimated me. They underestimated Sarah. "They're bluffing," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming. "Julian thinks he can bully you, but we have the law on our side, and more importantly, we have the evidence. And that licensing engine, that's your nuclear option." The nuclear option. The phrase resonated with me. The licensing engine wasn't just code, it was the company's very foundation. Its stability, its security, its continued functionality all depended on the intricate architecture I had designed. And Julian, in his arrogant haste, had cut off the only person who truly understood its every secret. We moved to the next phase, filing a formal lawsuit. The legal papers landed on Julian's desk like a thunderclap. The charges were comprehensive: wrongful termination, breach of contract, failure to provide adequate notice and severance, and most damningly, intellectual property violations concerning my ongoing rights to the licensing engine. We also hinted at potential age discrimination, though that was a secondary, supporting argument. The news hit the company like a shockwave. Whispers turned into open discussions. Employees, many of whom had seen Julian's ruthless purchase firsthand, started to feel a perverse sense of satisfaction. Investors, alerted by the legal filings, began to ask uncomfortable questions. The company's stock, which had been stagnant under Julian's leadership, started to dip. Julian, of course, was furious. He tried to discredit me, leaking stories to the press about my supposed inefficiency, my resistance to change. But Sarah was prepared. She countered with my impeccable performance reviews, testimonials from former colleagues who, now that I was no longer an employee, felt emboldened to speak, and detailed explanations of my contributions to the company's success, all backed by irrefutable documentation. The real leverage, however, came from the licensing engine itself. The lawsuit didn't just demand financial compensation, it sought an injunction to prevent the company from making any significant modifications to the engine without my consultation, citing my contractual rights. This was a direct threat to their operations. Any major update, any new client integration, any expansion of their services, all could be stalled by my legal action. The company faced the very real prospect of its core business being paralyzed. Julian tried to find someone else to take over the engine. To prove I was indeed dead weight, he brought in a team of external consultants, brilliant on paper, but utterly lost in the labyrinthine complexity of my creation. They struggled to understand its nuances, its hidden dependencies, the elegant but intricate solutions I had woven into its fabric over 16 years. They quickly realized that without my specific, detailed knowledge, any significant alteration carried enormous risk. A single misstep could bring the entire system crashing down, jeopardizing millions in revenue and potentially exposing the company to legal liabilities. Panic began to set in at the company. Board members, concerned about the plummeting stock price and the growing legal costs, started to pressure Julian. His father, Mr. Henderson, now frail but still sharp, heard about the lawsuit through his old network. He was reportedly devastated, furious that his son had so carelessly dismantled the loyalty and trust he had built. He called Julian, demanding answers, and the pressure mounted. The climax came during a mediation session. Julian sat across from me, his face pale, his usual arrogance replaced by a visible tremor of fear. Sarah was relentless, presenting a mountain of evidence, calmly dissecting every one of Julian's counterarguments. The company's lawyer, a seasoned veteran, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He knew they were cornered. Finally, Sarah dropped the hammer. My client, Helen, is not simply seeking monetary damages. She is seeking the full and immediate reinstatement of her contractual rights regarding the licensing engine, including all outstanding royalty payments and a public acknowledgement of the company's wrongdoing. Furthermore, she stated, her voice cutting through the tension, we are prepared to argue that Mr. Julian Henderson's gross mismanagement and disregard for established legal protocols have caused significant financial and reputational damage to the company, and as such, his continued leadership is detrimental to shareholder value. The implication was clear. Julian's job was on the line. Not just mine, but his. His father's legacy, his own reputation, his entire future, all hung precariously in the balance, threatened by the very woman he had so casually dismissed as deadweight. Julian's face contorted. He knew. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the quiet woman who knew every bite and every clause of the system that kept his company afloat. He had been so blinded by his own hubris that he had failed to see the weapon he himself had handed me. The settlement was monumental. It wasn't just the full severance, the back pay for the royalty payments, and a substantial sum for damages. It included a long-term consulting contract for me, ensuring my continued involvement with the licensing engine, but on my terms, with my rates. It also stipulated a public apology from the company, acknowledging my invaluable contributions and the regrettable circumstances of my departure. And, perhaps most satisfyingly, it included a provision that Julian Henderson would step down from his role as CEO, transitioning to a non-executive board position, effectively stripping him of his power. The news broke publicly a few weeks later. The stock rallied, buoyed by the prospect of competent leadership returning. Julian, humbled and disgraced, issued a terse, carefully worded statement about pursuing new opportunities. He faded into the background, his brief, destructive reign brought to an end by the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. I didn't return to my old office. Instead, I set up a new consulting firm, working on projects I chose on my own schedule. The company, now under the leadership of a far more pragmatic and respectful interim CEO, became one of my first clients. I still oversee the licensing engine, but now I do so as an independent expert, a valued consultant, not an expendable employee. The irony is not lost on me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the hum of servers in my memory, but now it's a sound of triumph, not routine. Julian thought he could erase me, that he could simply cut me out of the company's fabric. But he forgot that sometimes the most vital threads are the ones you can't see, the ones woven deep into the core. And if you try to pull them out carelessly, the whole tapestry unravels. My revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, meticulous, and utterly devastating. It was the sweet sound of justice, delivered with the precision of a well-coded algorithm.